over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debbie, so much for the introduction. I'll be sure to send a shorter version of that next time, so my apologies. But no, thank you so much for having me today. As Debbie noted, I'm partner in charge of government services at SICH. Want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here. Particularly want to thank Jody and Scott for coordinating with me, working through your relationship with the Illinois Government Finance Officers Association, IGFOA, and just excited to kind of go through and talk about the most recent round of stimulus that's out there. So I'm going to share my screen here again, provide kind of a high-level overview for you in terms of the ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act here. So bear with me 1 second. We'll get this fired up here. All right, and can everyone see the slides okay here?
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect, wonderful. So as noted, the American Rescue Plan Act is the most recent, or ARPA, as I'll refer to it throughout the presentation today, the most recent round of stimulus that the federal government has provided in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This was signed by President Biden back on March 11 of 2021. Included $65.1 billion distributed to municipalities across the country. In looking at those amounts there, those amounts are being distributed in a couple of two different tranches, one initial tranche and then one that's going to be provided a year later for that. From a program overview standpoint, the Treasury is overseeing ARPA, and Treasury has issued what's referred to as an interim final rule, or an IFR. This was adopted back on May 10th. And the purpose of the interim final rule, and it's somewhat unique that it was an interim rule. Generally, when they issue these rules, and especially when it comes to a program of this magnitude, it's generally going to be a what we call a final rule, not have that interim title, interim tag on there. But the purpose of the interim final rule, or IFR, is to go through and provide guidance on what Treasury, as the funding source, considers to be eligible programs and services. Now, for the ARPA program, this was really built off of those previous principles that we saw from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or the CRF fund, for that. This also gave us reporting requirements, and then comments on the interim financial rule were due, or interim final rule were due back to Treasury on July 16th. They're going to review those comments, incorporate those comments into a final rule with additional guidance on that. So the big question under ARPA, I think the one that, and I actually was at a conference earlier this morning, and this was a topic that we went through and looking at is okay, we have this additional set of dollars coming in to our counties for this, to our organizations for this. How can we spend these dollars? Again, those same spending principles given there. Treasury has a great quick reference guide that's out there. If you haven't taken a look at that, I encourage you to do so. I have some of those links later in the presentation materials for you as well today. But ultimately, and we'll go through these all in more detail, but supporting the public health response, addressing the negative economic impacts of the pandemic, replacing public sector revenue loss. Talk a little bit more about that. That's kind of the the grayest of the areas in terms of how those dollars can be spent. Premium pay for essential workers, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure encompassed in the 5th and 6th points there. And the last piece is equity-focused services. High level, equity-focused services, and just a general comment in regards to how Treasury wants these funds to be spent. And there's been various webinars and other guidance that they've put out, that the White House has put out on this. The equity-focused services is really a key focal point of this administration in terms of how these dollars are spent. So incorporating that into planned use of these dollars and how those dollars are being spent is definitely going to be something that would be advisable. We're getting just a little bit of feedback, so if everyone doesn't mind muting, that would be just so we can minimize any background noise, that would be helpful as well. So going through supporting the public health response, the first component of that is looking at continuing to fund COVID-19 mitigation efforts, whether those are medical expenses, behavioral health care, certain staff that are involved in the public health and safety realms for that, certain examples that Treasury has provided here, certain things directly tied to that, related to that, the vaccination, contract tracing, quarantine costs that people are incurring as part of that. From a behavioral healthcare services, certainly the impact of the pandemic, we've seen, and speaking to to this group, I think many of us expect that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of the impact of this pandemic on the the mental health and the long-term mental health impact for this, whether that be from a remote work, remote education, whatever those situations may be there. So behavioral healthcare services is a specifically identified item within the ARPA guidance and the Treasury's guidance on this in terms of how these dollars can be used. Crisis intervention covered there as well. And then payroll and covered benefits. This is to the extent worked on the COVID-19 response. Now there is a unique difference on the spending, and we'll cover this in a moment on the FAQ related to those payroll and covered benefits. So just if that's something that you are utilizing ARPA dollars on, the documentation requirements may be a little bit more stringent on how you spend those dollars. Addressing negative economic impacts, economic harm to impacted sectors and impacted community members on this, public sector, restoring public sector capacity is one of the examples Treasury gives here as well. You can see some of the other items here. Replacing public sector revenue loss. Now, this is an exercise that many of your county finance departments may be going through in terms of this calculation to support and to substantiate what that revenue loss number is. The reason that the revenue loss is an interesting component, and if that's how those amounts are classified, is it actually does provide some greater flexibility, as I noted earlier, kind of the grayer area in terms of how those dollars can be spent, a little bit more leeway, if you will, on that. ARPA also continues to allow premium pay for essential workers, those who are exposed to the greatest risks during the course of the pandemic. This can happen in a couple different ways, directly to the employees themselves or the essential workers themselves, or through grants to those employers. That second bullet point here, looking at the prioritization, here's kind of the equity focused piece that's worked into the legislation itself. And these have to be fully additive services. What I mean by that is that these have to be, if somebody has salary of X, it just can't be to, if they received a, we're furloughed, it can't be just to make them whole. This has to be making them whole and then additional premium pay for that. I mentioned the infrastructure pieces, water, sewer infrastructure, and broadband infrastructure here. Again, the equity focused here. And then finally, the equity focused services as kind of the catch-all at the end here. Some of the examples provided here, again, are hardest hit communities and families from the pandemic, working to address health disparities, housing, education, and creating those healthy childhood environments. Within that and under that equity focused umbrella, Treasury does have more broad usage that they are giving, and kind of more, again, similar to the revenue loss components, there are more leeway on how those dollars can be spent. There are a few disallowed uses for this. I'll run through these again, high level here. Not able to deposit any of these dollars into to pension funds there. These are not intended to be used to reduce unfunded liabilities for pension funds. However, if you do have a salary if you are using them for premium pay or those types of things, and there is a pension component to that as part of kind of the normal salary contribution with that, that is allowable. It's just the one-time extraordinary payments are not allowed by this. Offsetting a reduction in net tax revenue. As I kind of noted here, this is not as simple as you would think it to be. I think the number ended up being around 21 or 22 attorney generals joined a lawsuit against the federal government on this because they had planned tax decreases or flat taxes on there, and they said, well, how is this going to be viewed? We already had this in place. So instead of me diving deeper into it, if you're interested in kind of more of how those calculations happen, I do have a link here out to a Tax Policy Center article that goes through that in greater detail. Other ineligible uses, not able to be used for debt service, legal settlements, judgments, not able to replenish those rainy day or financial reserves for this. And then general infrastructure is a disallowed use outside of the water, sewer, and broadband, or above any amount that was allocated under the revenue loss provision. So some of the frequently asked questions, and Treasury has a pretty robust document that they update on a regular basis with these frequently asked questions here. But the key takeaway in this first one here, question 2.2, is that costs that are generally allowable under the Coronavirus Relief Fund guidance are going to continue to be guidance under the ARPA guidance here. The one major difference, I know a lot of the CARES dollars initially were given a kind of a blanket assumption that public health and public safety, that those individuals were considered to be fully responsive to the COVID-19 pandemic, made the application process and the reporting process somewhat simple and streamlined for many folks on that, because you were able to just say, well, this is the payrolls that we are claiming for this to get our money, and being able to have that be a relatively, again, straightforward component of those grant dollars under the Coronavirus Relief Fund or the CRF funds there. That blanket assumption is not allowed under the ARPA guidance here. You have to be greater than 50% dedicated for those costs on the salary pieces there, and be able to document that. This is going to fall under, as federal dollars, subject to what's called the uniform guidance and required for additional compliance testing for this there. So being able to document, if you are using it for a salary piece there, how those amounts are, again, being substantiated to show that greater than 50% dedication to the COVID-19 pandemic response. Lost revenue, you may have heard a lot of conversation on the lost revenue standpoint. Lost revenue is going to follow the definition of general revenue from the US Census Bureau. I could spend half an hour talking just about the lost revenue calculation. Thankfully, and hopefully for everyone's sanity, we'll not do that today. That's a lot to that, to that calculation there. It does allow some more flexibility here, as noted. Provision of government services is really what the revenue loss dollars can be spent for. So you'll see here, this is where general infrastructure, you can use this on roads, cybersecurity, health services is specifically noted as one of the general allowable uses here. So again, just more flexibility in terms of the revenue loss and how those dollars particularly can be spent when they're quantified and supported through the revenue loss calculation. Timing on this, one of the questions that came up, this is GFOA is the Government Finance Officers Association. GFOA has a separate frequently asked questions page related to the various stimulus amounts that have been provided for this. One of the questions was, do funds have to be expended by December 31st, 2024 or obligated by that time period? It does not, they're not required to be expended, but an obligation does have to be incurred. You can see there what that definition is for, for an obligation for that in terms of how those amounts are going to, how that's going to be determined as part of that. As expected, with a program of this magnitude, there are reporting guidelines for this. On the leftmost column, you'll see this broken down by the various recipient types that exist here, and then the various reporting types that are required here. So basically everyone had to do, outside of the non-entitlement units, had to do an interim report by August 31st, breaking out expenditures by category. For the project and expenditure report, depending on the size of your government, either October 31st with a quarterly report thereafter, or October 31st and an annual report thereafter. And then only the largest of the entities required to do the recovery plan performance reports. The initial one, again, being due August 31st, and then an annual report by July 31st going forward there. Additional information on the links below, and again, I'm happy to provide these slides to the group afterwards as well, so you can review this guidance or reference this as you need to here. Did mention that as recipients of ARPA funds, you will be subject to the uniform guidance. This is in addition and supplemental to any other guidance or requirements that are outlined as part of that interim final rule. Treasury guidance specifically here, I'm going to see if this will cooperate for me here and just open this up here. I may have to change my screen share, so bear with me 1 second here, but do this. Go to the separate document here. So in terms of the reporting here, if any of you are involved in the reporting or working through the reporting, you'll see additional guidance here. This is a 29 slide deck that Treasury put on themselves here, kind of going into the key information here, looking at the general guidance in here. Again, same things that we've covered here, eligible uses on this, really required, talking about the timing of the reporting that we went through here. And then what this does is this provides the opportunity to further break down the reporting amounts into these expenditure categories. So Appendix 1 within this guidance includes 66 different expenditure categories here. You can see some of those components in here as well, like mental health services, separately listed here as 1.10 under the public health response there. Additional information here, again, not going to go through this particular deck in great detail here, but this is all the information basically that ultimately Treasury is going to look for as part of that reporting as well. You can find these just out on the Treasury's website as again, another resource to be able to look at as part of that information. Going back then to the presentation here, we'll see if this will click through for me. Again, audit impact for ARPA. These programs, over 750,000 are going to be automatically deemed higher risk and will be required to be tested as a major program. What this has done in many of the audit clients that we work with has been the major program, CARES or coronavirus relief funds spending on that has become that major program. Now you may have other major programs that exceed the $750,000 type A threshold for that. You may have multiple programs that are required to be tested as part of that this year. So something to be aware of there. If you have something that is a regular program that you've participated in that is tested as part of this, you may have an additional one depending on the timing and how you spend those ARP dollars. One thing we were hoping for that did not happen is the feds released the 2021 compliance supplement. Unfortunately, the ARP program guidelines and the supplement related to ARP specifically did not include the ARP funding for that. The separate number there, the 21027 CFDA or ALN, which is the assistance listing number here. So we do expect an addendum to be issued some point later this fall. Last year with the CARES, it was not until almost December 23rd, I believe, when they finally issued the guidance on that. Hopefully it's not as late this year on that. That may inhibit your timing of your single audit, the procedures that you're working through with your auditors, to the extent of your involvement on that end of the process. So with a program of this magnitude, one of the big things that you're going to want to make sure that you're doing, and encourage you within ACMHAI here to talk to your peers on this, in terms of there's no need necessarily to reinvent the wheel, but as you develop best practices for how these dollars are spent and what you're doing here, if you're developing narrative and control documentation on this, encourage you to collaborate with one another on that, or to share to the point that you're comfortable with on that. But basically being able to have these types of items in place. This is coming directly from the Treasury's compliance and reporting guidance here, but written policies and procedures, and then goes through in detail what should be encompassed as part of these particular practices, as well as examples for this. Having those controls and documentation in place on the front end is going to make your lives and anyone involved kind of in the audit process, your finance folks, others that may have responsibilities related to the reporting piece on this, it's just going to make things simpler for them. So do recommend kind of working and developing these narratives and these documentations related to this. With that, I mentioned earlier that we'd have kind of some reference and resource information that's included as part of the slides as well here. This is just a high-level snippet of what's out there. There's a wealth of information out there. I would just encourage you that, with that wealth of information comes a wealth of opinions on how those dollars can be spent. Have conversations, with internally on this, with your respective auditors on this. If you have a particular program or response that you're uncertain as to whether or not it would meet one of the criteria for spending under ARP, Treasury does have a separate email address set up here. The last bullet point, just reaching out to them directly with questions on that. As you can imagine, they are getting a significant volume of questions on that. So response time, give yourself some lead time, build in some lead time for that. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Do my best to answer any questions, I should say. This is all evolving as we go through here and get additional information from Treasury on that. But again, happy to answer any questions, and I just want to thank Scott and Jody and everyone for the opportunity to be here with you today.
I have a question, and I haven't read this or seen this specifically, but in discussions with our county administrator, who's kind of the person here that we talked to about ARPA funding, he is stating that in terms of making requests for that funding, it has to be one-time funding and funding that would not be continued funding. Now, to me, that sounds more like county policy versus what we're hearing here. Am I correct? Or is there anything that you've seen that references that?
Sure. So I would agree, Debbie, with your assessment that sounds kind of like that's a county specific approach on that. It's something to be cognizant of as you look at this, to say, these are, initially, not knowing all the funding sources that were going to come out initially in response to the pandemic on this. Many of these have been treated as, one-time revenue sources. So in terms of particular projects for that, can understand that approach on it there. For the example, and I look back at a similar, a grant similar situation on this where a grant that, if you were going to hire an individual for, a department there, you may be able to fund that individual's salary and benefit cost, for potentially, 3 to 4 years under ARPA for that. But then it becomes, okay, well then, do we no longer have, a position for that person when that funding runs out for that? Or do we have, where are we going to find the funding to continue that person's employment, when we've used up this funding for that? So I think it sounds like a, county specific policy on that, but that is likely the reason why the example that comes to mind for me. There was a grant several years ago that the Department of Justice issued and encouraged entities to hire additional public safety personnel. It was a 3-year grant. Many of them got to the end of that 3-year period and said, we're not going to be able to afford keeping this person on the payroll there. And there was a significant kind of clawback piece of it there. So they kind of changed their tune or turned the grant down basically. And in this case, it's, different circumstances for it, but I understand why, that policy would be, considered and potentially utilized for that.
Thank you. And I think that you hit it. I think it's sustainability. If it's a position, the sustainability of it would be come into question, because then after that period runs out, how do we continue to fund those positions if that's around employment? Yeah,
absolutely.
Any other questions?
If not, like I said, I'm happy to share the slides from the presentation. So Jody, I can send those over to you if you're able to disseminate those to the group on that. And then my contact information is in there. So certainly if there's questions or anything that I can be of assistance of, I'd be happy to help where I can.
Anthony, can I ask one before you leave?
Yeah, Scott, sure.
Majority of ACMHAI members would likely be sub-recipients of some type of these funds. Any tips to be aware of in regard to reporting structure and uniform guidance? That's probably something many of our smaller members are unfamiliar with, and why I have really chosen to inform my county's approach as opposed to lobbying to be a sub-recipient and then providing grants to our constituents. Because I think, there's some nuance, obviously, to uniform guidance, CFR 200, and some of those other reporting requirements.
Scott, that's a great question, and I've had that conversation with, a lot of what Treasury and what others under the uniform guidance are called prime recipients who receive those dollars themselves, and in terms of how they pass them through. So in terms of that, if you are set up as a and are being treated as a sub-recipient under the uniform guidance and as part of this particular grant funding for that, having those conversations on the front end, with the prime recipient there to ensure, what reporting requirements are going to be entailed for this, what are the timeframes for, submission on that. Basically, in an ideal world, they would be, very, very clear and direct on that in terms of what those requirements are on that, because they're going to not only have to obtain and review the subrecipient reports that they receive, but then compile all that information as part of their reporting as well on that as well. So as part of that process for that. So, Scott, to what you said, is kind of working with them as much as you can on the front end, while the program, even though it's, hot and heavy and running at this point on a lot of these, is still in its relative infancy for that. Being able to get out ahead of those things, I would absolutely encourage everyone to do, especially if you're in that subrecipient category there. You don't want it to be something where you're having to kind of pull all together the information at the last second for that. The other piece that would be helpful on this as well as a subrecipient is to ensure that you have a very distinct way of tracking and recording any dollars that you do have coming in and how you're spending those dollars and maintaining that documentation. I would encourage you, if you're, whether you're maintaining it electronically or, making copies of things there, you basically have an ARPA folder for that, or an ARPA, electronic or, print folder for that. Have all that information there. Err on the side of, keeping additional information in there if you think there's any chance whatsoever that it might be requested as part of that monitoring process there. Keep it in there. It's easier for folks to sort through and say, okay, no, we don't need this, but we do need this. And then just documentation on that. And I think, Scott, the last thing I'll say in response to your question there is, kind of goes back to the slide we looked at with those best practices. Ensuring that you have those items in place for that will, facilitate I won't say easier, but a smoother, a smoother piece for that. So,
Thank you.
of course.
Ron?
Yeah, is there any requirements on the unit of local government? And I cover a township, so I'm primarily concerned about money that's available from municipalities. Are there any requirements for them to follow a procedure that involves public input or public RFP, or how would providers know that this is available in a particular community that they might be serving?
Sure. So the requirements for any of the dollars spent under ARPA are kind of subject to those guidelines that we went through in terms of how those are distributed to those other units there. Being able to, trying to think of the in terms of the spending guidelines for that, let me kind of tackle, a couple of the, sub questions there individually on that. So in terms of the requirement for public input or having those discussions, there's no set requirement for that. Every conversation that I've been part of and every, webinar or guidance that I've participated in myself on that has strongly encouraged that. To engage the community on that, have those discussions on, what the greatest needs are. Actually, it was at a, listened to a panel discussion this morning where they talked about, you have different governmental entities receiving, different kind of buckets of funding, but then in this particular instance, they use them for very similar purposes there, whereas kind of that ability to strategically assess the overall community needs on that versus kind of what the immediacy is. And I think that's one of the nicer parts on ARPA is there is a little bit more time to make that assessment here and do that. Obviously, you want to address the high level needs up front on that, but being able to get that community involvement input from that, I think is beneficial. In terms of the spending requirements on that, the Code of Federal Regulations has specific guidance on project biddings and RFPs for that. Generally, in most cases, if your organization has a purchasing policy or purchasing procedures in place for that, in most cases, those will align pretty closely with the federal guidelines are kind of pretty high level there. So generally local guidelines are more restrictive on that. But
let me be a little more specific, maybe.
Sure.
Being a township government, we're not receiving any funds.
Right.
There's no funds available for townships.
Correct.
My township covers 17 municipalities in suburban Cook County, and those municipalities probably won't be receiving any county funds. My mental health and substance abuse and developmental disability providers aren't county-wide. They cover a group of suburbs, and so it probably would be difficult for them to apply to the county to manage it, and the county wouldn't be asking me to submit anything to the county.
Mm-hmm.
So how would say our local mental health provider, who's also the federally qualified health center, know if funds are available in the 17 villages that are in our township. They're not going to tell me. Are they going to tell the agencies? Are they required to publish the fact that these funds are being looked at?
Anthony, and this is, an ongoing conversation that I've had with the McHenry County, the elected McHenry County board, and they've hired a third-party administrator to help determine how they're going to disseminate information, develop RFP process. And so I think that's going to look different in each community, depending on that primary governing body and who they want to make the money available to and how they want that process to look. So that'll change across all of our 708 boards.
Right. Yeah, we experienced the same thing as Scott mentioned. I know our county has a group of bankers that they have pulled together as a group that will, all of the applications will go through them and they will make the decisions on where the funding goes to.
Right. But you only have to deal with one governmental entity. In Cook County, there's 160 suburbs.
Right.
So that's why I'm
asking.
asking.
More complicated for sure.
And there's smaller pools of money and smaller administration. Some of the suburbs only have 15,000 people or 13,000 people. So it's pretty much a mess, huh?
Yeah, it sounds
Okay.
good.
I mean, I mean, to that question, I mean, I think it's a matter of, and I think Scott kind of hit on this, is how those individual, municipal entities within the township are going to determine to do that and do, again, with the program still being in its relative infancy and there still being opportunities to have those discussions, it would be connecting to say, if the, providers were able to, quantify and say, hey, we know that the village received X amount of dollars, or we received your first tranche and you're going to be getting your, next year getting a second tranche here. We have a project. If they don't have something necessarily, or if they're looking for ways to do that, I think we will see, I'm hopeful that we will see more, municipalities and some of the counties, putting out information on this to be able to say, we have available resources, and apply to do that. And then whether it's a third party or they identify someone or bring, have someone, from the respective organizations and entities who go through that process and, make those assessments and determine those allocations.
Okay.
Ron, I wanted to mention also, so I'm in the same boat as you. I'm in Cook County and we serve multiple municipalities. And some of our agencies are in multiple counties. But I do know that some of our agencies are working together to kind of hit up the RFP and the funding hearings. So I know that our Human Services Coordinating Council kind of works together to divide up some of those funding hearings from the municipalities and from the county. And so they advocate for each other in that sense, because there's no way that any agency can hit up every one of those.
Right.
And so they are kind of working together to advocate for each other. And that's been my experience. And so sometimes I'll communicate when there's a hearing, whether it be countywide or municipality wide, and they will kind of organize which one of them goes.
Okay. Okay, I'm having a agency executive director advisory council meeting coming up. And so that's why I was attending this and trying to figure out a way we can lead a discussion and help them. And that's been helpful, at least. And at least I have some of the information that I can give them to try and attract some of this funding.
Ron, another thing, ours was broadcasted through newspapers and local media as well. They made announcements to the public that these funds were available in the process and who to go through to put your application into.
Okay, I haven't seen anything from the villages, but again, they're small geographies, and most of our local papers now have been bought up either by the Chicago Sun-Times or the Chicago Tribune.
That might be a suggestion to take forward to your advisory group in terms of publicizing what they're doing.
Absolutely. Okay.
Looks like we had one other question in the chat box from Donna about how general was the August 31st report expected to be?
The expectation from what we have seen on those is that it was a pretty high level generic report for that, being many entities had we're still in kind of the investigative phase in terms of how they were going to spend those dollars, and the discussion phase on that. So we have not seen did not see a ton of detail in those initial reports. I think more so like many grants, the ongoing quarterly reports we expect to be more of the detail intensive reports.
Are we good, Jody? Any more
I think
questions?
so, yeah, I don't see any
Okay.
other, does anybody else have any other questions before Anthony takes off?
Not seeing any. Anthony, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for your insights and the information that you shared with us today.
My pleasure. Have a great rest of your meeting, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. So
Thank you so
take
much.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so we're going to just move into roundtable discussion and more thoughts and discussion around this. I know we shared a couple of items there. I was just kind of writing some notes down as I was going through that, just some of the main things that he talked